Ladies, welcome back to week 9 of A Time for Women. My name is Deidre, and I'm here with
Shay and Ashley.
Can you believe we have done 9 weeks? 9 weeks of choosing community and reconnecting to who our God is through a study of his names. I've really enjoyed this semester. It's provided me with the opportunity to just sit at his feet and soak in the goodness of who he is and how who he is always the answer to my needs. I hope the same has been true for you and for you. Not surprisingly, as we've discovered, this name we're about to study shows up one time in the Bible. Maybe this reveals that we didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into by the fact we were all surprised by that.
We were surprised.
Fact. And to be honest, I was a little bit bothered. I like to dig into the scripture. I don't want you to hear what I have to say. I want you to hear what the Bible has to say. And I wanted lots of passages to dig into to teach these names. And that just wasn't an option. As I wrestled with that, I thought about the fact that, well, the image that came to my mind was the day my husband and I got married. On that day, he was declared husband. He's not still called husband often. I don't introduce him that way. His name is Cameron. But being a husband informs so much of what he does. And people who know him and interact with him but don't know me find out still that he's a husband, right? Because it has become part of who he is, and it informs how I interact with him. And I think we see that in these names, right? There's one time where God has declared this. He's given a name, but then we see the fruit of that all throughout Scripture.
I like that.
So it's been kind of fun to see. But back to this name. So as I said, it appears once at the very end of the book of Ezekiel. And if I'm completely honest, I was pretty uninspired by the section of scripture it was found in. I was a little disappointed. But before we get there, I really want to tell you a little bit about Ezekiel because I think he's a pretty cool guy.
Where's Ezekiel? I don't think I know.
It's there, I promise. You'll find it kind of in the middle.
It's after Lamentation.
Yeah. Anyway, so if you've been around the church for a while, you may recognize the name of Ezekiel, and you may know that he's a major prophet in the Old Testament. A prophet is just a person chosen to speak for God and to guide his people. What you may not know is that Ezekiel was actually a prisoner of war. Babylon had conquered Israel, taken many captives, and Ezekiel was among the first wave of them. On his 30th birthday, while sitting outside his refugee camp where he lived, Ezekiel received a vision from God and thus began his ministry. Now, his 30th birthday is actually pretty significant. Ezekiel had chosen priesthood. This is a choice people make young in life, and they dedicate themselves to it. It takes a ton of study, a ton of diligence, a ton of sacrifice, all kind of culminating on your 30th year of life when you're finally able to be inducted into the Israelite priesthood. That wasn't going to happen for Ezekiel on his 30th birthday. So I can imagine that he wasn't doing much celebrating that day. And if I were in his shoes, I'd likely be thinking of all the dreams that weren't being realized, wondering if my planning, my preparation, my hopes, my sacrifice had all been for nothing. But God, right? Like he shows up. He always shows up. And so here's Ezekiel sitting by this river, and God shows up and gives him a vision, and thus begins Ezekiel's ministry. That's where the book starts. It wasn't what Ezekiel had prepared himself for, so he thought, but is exactly what God had laid out before him. I really doubt he expected to be a biblical author. I think he would be surprised to find out that thousands of years later, we're still studying his words and in it discovering the beauty of who our God is. But I digress, right? Because we're not talking about Ezekiel, we're talking about God and his names. So Ezekiel ended up writing 48 chapters of prophecy. That's a lot. Yeah. Some of it he saw fulfilled in his lifetime, but much of it he didn't. At the very end of it all, literally the very last 4 words of the entire book, we find the name for this week. The verse, Ezekiel 48:35. The distance all around will be about 6 miles. And the name of that city from that time on will be, the Lord is there. Jehovah Shammah, the Lord is there. Reading this verse, you might ask, so where exactly is this, the Lord is there city?
Yeah.
And maybe more importantly, what does that mean for me as a Christ follower in 2020? But in order to best answer that, I feel like I kind of need to summarize Ezekiel's 48 chapters.
Yes.
So I promise it won't be long, but bear with me. So, Shazan, you're here for it. Let's do this. All right. Sitting outside his refugee camp, Ezekiel receives a vision of God's glory in Babylon. Now you have to understand, this would be really confusing for an Israelite, because for them, God's glory only dwelled above the Ark of the Covenant inside the temple. So God reveals to Ezekiel that he was actually forced to abandon his temple because of the idolatry and injustice of Israel. Eventually, the Babylonians came along, completely destroyed Jerusalem, and the temple of God was left in ruins. This was likely the greatest catastrophe Israel had ever seen, and caused many to ask, is God done with us? Thankfully, we know the story doesn't end there, but they felt like it did for a while. God gives Ezekiel a vision of hope that starts with Israel, it stretches to the nations, and eventually restores all of creation. The vision begins with our Messiah, continues with the promise of all of us receiving soft, new hearts, and his Spirit being able to dwell within us. And then comes the new city, with a new temple, a new priesthood, and a whole new way of worship. Finally, God's glory, the same glory from the very beginning of the book, shows up again, and it returns and dwells in this new temple. From that temple, a tiny stream flows out. That stream quickly turns into a raging river, flows out of the city and into a very desolate desert, the Dead Sea Valley. The stream leaves behind it vegetation and life all along its path, turning the Dead Sea into a living sea teeming with life, making evident that God's plan has always been and will always be to restore all of creation and humanity back to his life-giving presence. And this new garden city is given the name Jehovah Shammah. The Lord is there. Suddenly, the uninspiring passage takes on a little bit new life, right? Doesn't it? City measurements don't really get me very excited. But when I see it in the whole context of Ezekiel, I see how intimate our God is. Where they lived, how their cities were laid out, what the temple looked like, all had great meaning to ancient Israel, and honestly does to many still today. God knew that, and he delivers a message to them that says, I see you in your refugee camp, your city, your homes destroyed, your way of life and worship completely disrupted, and I'm going to fix it all. I promise you there is a day when you will live in a beautiful city where all is restored, and I, the God of the universe, the great I Am, will be there with you. Additionally, this is the last time we learn a name of God in the prophets. It's as if the whole Old Testament was structured so we end with this name, the final promise that in the end, no matter what we have seen or walked through, regardless of how desolate or hopeless it has all seemed, there is a future and final hope. A time when God will dwell among his people and restore the life-giving existence he has planned for all of creation. There's such finality, such hope when we see that. And I wonder, for you two, how does that give you hope right now?
I think we've all been in that place where when you feel like you've hit rock bottom, I think a very natural question to ask is like, where you at, God? Mm-hmm. Like, where are you in the midst of this? Like, with all your promises, and if you truly are love, like, how is this my reality? And yeah, just that, the simplicity of God is there. It changes everything, because if all those other things are true, then that means that he still is love. He still is all that he promises to be in that moment, in those circumstances. And so, like, I think it makes me think of, like, when you're a kid and you do something kind of scary, but your parent is there and they're like, it's gonna be all right. Like, I remember, I think I was like 3 at Disneyland, and I was super scared of like the tiki room. It had like all these little parrots, and it was just really
Oh, I
freaky
remember
and
that
dark
room.
to me.
Yeah, it is.
But I'd have this memory of like my dad holding me and being like, I'm here. And even though it was like chaos and terrifying, there was comfort in
Yeah.
that like
Yeah,
if
that's
he
beautiful.
knows me, if he knows what circumstances are happening, I'm gonna be okay.
I was thinking of also just as the word like evangelism came to my mind because as you're describing just like the sadness, the destruction, and the brokenness, I'm like, that's the reality of people. And I was like, and we face it on any level right now, but those just that don't have a relationship with Jesus, they lack hope of perfect love or the unity or this city, the idea of this city, and so I think this truth, like the Lord is there, while He's always there for them, but it's like they're not in relationship with Him, and they don't have this hope of this future city where there is the perfection of all those things. And so I think for me, as I was thinking about that, it's just spurs me on to like what conversations and how can I invite people into relationship with Jesus, to have this relationship with God where they can experience these things in full measure, and have a hope for beyond this.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah,
It's
no,
really
it
beautiful.
makes total sense. And I love how both of you did that. Because, right, like this, when you first read the name, it's like this not yet promise.
Right.
Like
Right.
one day we will get to experience it. But we have the privilege of living in a time in history when all of God's promises have a not yet, but also a now
Yes.
reality
Yes.
to them.
Yeah.
And so the same is true of this name, right? Because we know that God is with us. Sure, it's not yet that we dwell in this city with all of His people and Him, and where His goodness and His justice and His mercy are the way of the land. We don't live there.
Right.
If there's anything that an election season reminds me of, it's that we don't live there yet, and I desperately long for a day when we do. But there's the element of the Lord is there that I live into right now because He is here, right? Like the psalmist reminds us, Psalm 139, that there's nowhere we can go to get away from His presence, right? The highest heights, the lowest depths, the evening, the morning, the land, the sea. It doesn't matter what we imagine. There's no place in creation that He's not. He's there. But what's even more is that the Messiah has come. And He's dealt with my sin and made it possible for His Spirit not just to dwell around me, but within me. And He's not just like here, kicking it on the sidelines, popping some popcorn, like watching the scene of my life go by, right? Like that's not how it is, right? He is my and your very present help, right? Like He's involved. He's sharpening, He's shaping, protecting, and guiding us. And so I don't know about you, but sometimes it's hard for me to believe. Again, don't get me wrong, I know He's omnipresent, to use the theological term. I get that He's big and He fills all of creation, and no matter where I am, He's there. But I sometimes struggle to remember that He's with me. Just because He's there, I forget that He's with me, that He goes before me, that He stands beside me, and is being my very present help. Sometimes my circumstances or those of my loved ones seem so dark, so desolate, and so hopeless that I can forget that even there, even in the midst of that, He's with me. It reminds me of a time, a long time ago, I guess now, my family was going through a really dark season. And my dad is this like Mexican Marine who's like the toughest man you'll ever meet, and like if the world is caving in, everyone wants to be at his house because they know they'll be okay. Like he just is that man that everyone
Zombie apocalypse.
yeah, right, like everyone feels safe around, and there's no conquering my dad. And I remember I was away at college and his voice broke as he said, "Deidre, I need you." Never in my life since or before have I ever heard my dad say those words. And so I went home and I was with my family as we just walked through these really hard things. And I went back to college when it was time for me to go back. And I remember being in church just being mad. Sorry. Like, God, where are you? I don't want to do this by myself. This isn't fair. This isn't right. And he just brought to mind, like, remember when that friend came knocking at your door and you refused to answer? Or remember when that song came on and you started to feel good and you just got mad? And all of these other little moments. And it's like, he just said to me, those were me. Those were whispers of me telling you, I'm here. And it's dark and it's hard, but I'm here. Would either of you be willing to share a time when God reminded you that he was here?
I was thinking of, I went on this hike and hiked the Grand Canyon. Very casually.
Some hike.
Very casually hiked the Grand
Just a
Canyon.
hike.
But to do that, to prep for that, you have to walk a lot to prepare and to train. And for most of that, you have to walk many miles, obviously, and so I'd always have like music or a podcast, or sometimes I did it with friends, and so we just chat. And I think I, in this season as well, had just gotten a little disconnected from the Lord, just intimacy-wise. And I remember one walk, I just I'm not going to listen to anything. I'm just going to walk and be silent. And there was just this flood. It's like it was messages, like it was like downloaded messages where I just started thinking all these things, and they were hard things to think of. But I realized that walking in this silence, it gave my heart and my mind some space for the Lord to kind of reveal that he's there, to speak to me, that he was there. And I didn't feel like he was at the time, but I'd so almost kind of drowned him out in a lot of moments in my life that I wasn't able to feel and hear that, I guess. And so that silent walk just gave room for him for me to understand that and feel that, and for him to kind of expose some things in my life that really ultimately kind of made me want to draw into him in some areas that I didn't want to, that I was kind of pushing away, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that now, whenever I'm busy and I feel a little disconnected and I'm asking, like, where are you? This is hard. Just walk silently. And it's just letting him, for some reason, for me, that, I guess this is a personal thing, that he generally will come to me, and speak to me in that way, where I know that he's there and that he's for me. I don't know.
Yeah. That's really
It's kind of like very specifically personal, but
Thank you.
yeah.
Man, this was a good one to think about. I think the one that comes to mind is kind of different. I've shared different parts of my story at different times about like how I was like really on the brink of death with my mental illness, and then I had this miraculous healing, and then my life like really took this sharp turn into like missions. And it was while I was there that I lost a friend in a freak drowning accident, and then the shooting happened. And I think I see how I was like kind of floating on God's grace through all of those things, but I don't think I ever took a lot of time to really process like the things I had experienced and what I had gone through. And I remember I had this moment of quiet while I was leading a team of college students on a mission trip in Thailand. And I remember feeling like it all kind of hitting me. And during that time too, I had just been in a relationship with a guy that had fallen apart in a really terribly messy way that just left me feeling discouraged. And I was in this worship service in Thailand, led by this guy who was like speaking Indonesian, being translated into Burmese and then back into, like, it was the craziest. And then this worship service started and we took communion. And I had this moment where like I'm reflecting like on God and who he was and like what this cup meant. And I felt God ask me like, will you drink the cup? Like the cup of suffering. Like, because that's what Jesus says, like, well, if you'll take this cup from me. And I felt like God was saying, like, so I realized I was throwing this pity party for myself. Like, why have I lost all these things? Because I was having this identity crisis too about losing everything that I was before my mental illness, and anyway. And I just felt like God was like next to me, saying yes to the future, because it's not going to be easy. There's going to be more.
Yeah.
And are you saying yes? But it was like, I'm here with you, and I'm asking you if you'll drink, and I'm telling you that I'll be there. And like, never has a spiritual moment been more burned into my mind, where I felt like I can say yes because I know you're here, and I know you're the one who's asking me. And so rather than this like moment of like victory and breakthrough and winning in a good way, it felt like acceptance of the broken world and the broken future, and yet saying yes to a God who had never left me and would never leave me.
Yeah. Gosh, I need these stories, right? Like, to remind me, like, that he is here and he doesn't ever leave us, right? He never has, he never will. And they remind me how privileged we are to no longer need to go to the right place and offer the right thing and have the right person enter his presence on our behalf, right? That's all been taken care of in the sacrifice of Jesus. Not only do I get to dwell with his presence around me in creation, but I have the opportunity for his presence to dwell within me, to be his temple. I hope that all of you have taken him up on that. And if you haven't but want to know more, please ask someone about it. Let somebody know. Press in. I promise you won't regret it. So as I cling to the now of this promise, right, I also need to not lose sight of the not yet, of my opportunity to pull the not yet into the present, allowing his life-giving presence to fill me and to inform all that I do, so that I can create around me a place where his grace and his mercy, his justice and his goodness are what are in the air, right? I want the now. And one day we will live with him in a city dominated by his justice, goodness, grace, and mercy. One day we'll live in the city known for the life that flows out of every inch of it, because life dwells there. Oh, how we long for that day, right? But in the meantime, let's live into that promise. Live into the truth that whatever depths you find yourself in, whatever hardship, joy, sorrow, or rejoicing, life, our Jehovah, the great I am, who shepherds and leads and guides, the God of peace and provision, who is sovereign, our banner, who sanctifies, is in the midst with us. And let me leave you with this image. About the time when I was going through this dark season, my future husband, I did not know he would be my husband, but he had returned to his hometown of Tokyo, Japan, to start a youth ministry. Their church didn't have one, and he saw this massive need in the community. And so as a sophomore in college, he convinced the church that they needed it, and he was going to do it.
Wow.
So he moved back to Tokyo to run this ministry, and as you can imagine, it was hard. It's not a closed country, but it's not a very open country either. And he had gone for a run because he too felt angry and alone. And he'd kind of come up on this bridge where normally he could see Mount Fuji. And in this season, it was cloudy and he couldn't see Mount Fuji. And he said it was as if the clouds opened and God's voice spoke to him and said, "Do you believe that the mountain is there, even though you cannot see it?" And he was like, "Well, yeah, duh." Right? And then he said this massive wind came, as if a wind that would blow him over. And he knew the presence of God was in that wind. And he found out later that the Hebrew word for wind is the same word for spirit. And in that moment he realized, even when I can't see you, even when I can't see the fruit of it, I know the mountains of your glory are there. And I'm going to remember that presence. And I hope you too will have mountains of his glory that you can remember. He is with you wherever you are.